What's good, y'all? I'm Enzo Greymane, and I'm currently working on finishing up the world's most epic miniature paint rack. Some of you might be thinking that's a bold claim, and so I'm just going to get right into it and show off all the features that currently make it the world's most epic. And then by the end of the video, I'm going to seal the deal on that. First and foremost, capacity is the most important thing in a paint rack, right? What's the point of even building something out of metal, taking all the time to fabricate it, print all the inserts, so on and so forth, unless it can fit a lot of paint? This thing currently fits nearly 500 bottles of paint at 477. The top shelf up here fits 135 bottles of Pro-Acryl or Citadel paint pots. The lower three shelves can fit 114 bottles each of Vallejo, AK, Army Painter, Scale 75, and your other typical 15 milliliter paint bottles. At half 1,000 bottles of paint, that's pretty good capacity, and I've actually filled it already, so I'm going to show that off later once the paints are all in there and we're done finishing this thing. The next epic feature of this paint rack is the fact that it was designed to have as much visibility per shelf as possible. You can see here that there's only two support members at the rear of the frame to hold up each shelf. This allows you to view the paints from almost 180 degrees around the whole entire paint rack. And that makes it a lot better than some of the other paint racks you might see front supports or other things that might interrupt your view of the paints. The next item on the list is durability. As you can see, I fabricated this paint rack by welding together some steel tubes and some angle iron. The thickness on the steel tubes and the angle iron is very thick, well over 1/8 of an inch for each component. That makes this paint rack very heavy duty and heavy. It currently sits at 27 pounds without any paints on it. I have a suspicion that this paint rack will last longer than me and definitely longer than any of the paints that I put inside of it. The fourth element that makes this paint rack epic is mobility. When you consider how heavy just the frame is alone, and then you throw on 477 bottles of paint to that, the weight gets to nearly 50 pounds. There's also no clear or easy way to grab onto it and lift it by hand. So you can see here that I've actually welded on some casters to the bottom that allows me to move it about the house, rolling it from room to room without any issue whatsoever. Additional to the casters though are some inserts that I put in the three lower shelves that you can just pop out and move to a different workspace if you'd like. You can set it down vertically, you can lay it down, and get on with your painting. When you're done, you just return it to the mothership and go about your day. So you're probably sitting there wondering, if this paint rack is already one of the most epic paint racks in the world, what could possibly make it better? Well, earlier on in the video, I talked about how important visibility was to me while designing the paint rack. And after using it for a while, I've learned that the top shelves cast quite a bit of shadows onto the lower ones, which makes it hard to pick out the colors I want, especially in the rear of the shelves here. In this video, what we're going to do is install an array of LED lights under the shelves, which will shine light down onto the paint caps. And when I go to pick out a color, I can see them very clearly and pick out the color I desire. On top of adding LED light strips to the paint rack, I'm also going to add a few small final touches, such as 3D printed caps for the ends of these tubes, which will be nice because these are a bit sharp and dangerous right now. And if you were to hit this into a wall or a person, it might cause some serious damage. So putting some nice soft caps on these and the lights is really going to elevate it, in my mind, to the most epic paint rack ever made. If you disagree, let me know in the comments, or if you have any design ideas that could elevate this even further, let me know. All right, so the first step on installing these LED lights is going to be drilling some holes and slicing some holes down here at the bottom of the frame. That way we can run the cabling and kind of hide it away within the tubing, and it's not sticking out. Okay, so in order to get access to this long tube that runs up to the shelves, our first cuts are gonna have to be down here in this tube, cutting out a square panel here, and then drilling a large hole on the other side in order to get access there. It's best to center punch metal before drilling into it. Otherwise, the drill bit has a tendency to dance around upon the surface. Once it was center punched, I drilled out the holes in the 4 corners. To cut the lines between the holes that I drilled, I used a 2-inch cutoff disc on my die grinder. I love using these small discs for short cuts because otherwise I might not get the depth I need. With that hole out of the way, it was time to drill a large hole into the other side of that tube. I first drilled it with a 1/2-inch drill bit and then proceeded to take a carbide burr to it to further carve it out. The carbide burr drew through the metal quickly, making the hole much larger. Always use your eye protection using this tool. I used a second carbide burr to smooth out the cuts that I made, otherwise the jagged edges might have cut into the insulation on the wiring. Now that the paint stand has holes in it, it's time to route the wiring. I have this 4-strand wire, but we are only going to need 3 of them, so I'm going to remove 1 strand. And you can see here behind me that I've already started routing the top hole. And as that gets down to the lower holes, I'm going to add more wiring and push them all down consecutively to this bottom part where we made access. The best wire to use when you're pushing wire through conduit or tube like this is to have a little bit stiff wires. Sometimes wire comes in like a rubberized silicone variety, and that would just get jammed up as you're trying to push it down. This stuff is pretty hard plastic and it's pretty stiff, so it makes it kind of easy to push it down. Just pluck that out. All right, there we go. All 3 wires coming out the bottom. So I'm going to give myself some slack here. We should have enough wire up here, which will be where this will be soldered onto the lights. Make sure we have enough on all of them, which we do. I forgot to drill the hole for the barrel plug, so I went ahead and drilled it out with a 1/2-inch drill bit. This is the 24-volt barrel plug. Should just pop right in there. Bob's your uncle. We got this installed. I just went ahead and put the nut on the back of it now because it was easier that way without the wiring on it. And I also passed 1 negative lead, which will go up to the front here at the control box, connecting from the power input to the control box. The power input will have a positive lead going to the switch, and then from the switch to the control box. I like to insulate all of my electrical joints with heat shrink tubing. This stuff is far better than electrical tape because it never comes undone. Just make sure you put it on before soldering the joint. When I solder a spliced joint like this, I make sure that all of the wire gets hot and that the solder will actually melt into the wire, impregnating it. If you don't heat up the wires properly, the solder will just gob up and not make a strong joint. Sometimes if you heat up the wiring and it gets pretty hot and your shrink wrap is very close to the size that you need to get it over, I would recommend waiting till that cools down. Otherwise, when you try to get that shrink wrap over it, it might shrink up right around that joint there and make it hard to get over this. You could use a small torch to shrink the tubing, but this battery-powered Makita heat gun is top shelf gear. What we have here is some high CRI LED strip lighting. And what I mean by high CRI is high color representation index. Typically, high CRI lights are used when you're taking video or taking photographs. And in this case, I'm using it because I want to see the perfect representation of the colors with this light shining on it. Cheaply made LEDs or old LEDs typically lack different wavelength bands within the spectrum, and therefore they don't reflect all of the light off of objects properly, giving you the right color representation. So what I'm going to do is cut up this LED strip light into a bunch of different small pieces. Each shelf is going to have 3 strips at 4 inches a strip. That will give each shelf a total of 12 inches of LED strip lighting, which I think should be plenty of light. When you cut these, you'll see that they have these copper areas here with a cut line. That copper pad area is where you solder on leads and make a connection to your circuit. So I'm going to cut up 9 pieces at 4 inches a piece, and that's just two spans of the copper. Okay, we got 9 pieces there. And then what I will do is solder leads onto one end of all 9 of these. Soldering leads onto these LED strips can be kind of difficult because the copper pads aren't very large. Therefore, I needed all the help I could get, so I used some flux on the copper pads first and added a dab of solder to them. I also tinned the wires previous to soldering the joints. So when I went to solder the actual joint, the best way was to heat the solder on the pad and in the wire at the same time and then merge them once they were both heated properly. I ended up getting a lot of practice doing these types of joints because I had to do over 50 or 60 of them. With the leads soldered onto the LED light strips, it was time to install them onto the paint rack. This was a very simple process because the LED light strips had an adhesive backing on them. I simply pull off the protective cover of the adhesive and then stick them down where I needed. I obviously took some precise measurements so that they were all spaced evenly. I believe it was at this part of the project that I realized just how much soldering it was going to end up being. And I had already done a lot at that point already. So last night I did quite a bit of soldering to get all of the lights installed here, but they're all installed now. I did solder a bunch of joints to power these 2 outside lights, but it's connected as a series through this one and a parallel to these 2 out here. You can see I have all the wiring done for each of the shelves. I was very pleased with the results and how hidden and low profile the lights looked. Okay, so this is where I'm going to install my switch panel. You can see where I have the 2 wires that will connect to the switch. I'm going to be drilling 2 holes on either side of this hole and then tapping them with 8x32 threading. Then the switch panel will just pop over there with the switch in it and have 2 screws to hold it down. To put threaded holes in steel, first you must drill it out a bit undersized. Then you add some Tap Magic lubricant to it and go at it with a tap. If you feel any resistance while turning the tap in the hole, make sure to back it out. This will break the chips and allow you to keep going. After some quick fabrication and prep work, I got this light switch panel all sorted out. You can see here that it's got a slot in the middle for where the switch is going to go and 2 holes to screw it onto the frame. I'm going to pass both of the positive red wires through this slot because it will solder onto the back of the switch, which I'll then be able to pop into place. While fabricating this switch panel, I took the extra time to countersink the holes. I also chose appropriate screws that would fit that countersink so that everything would be flush. I didn't want anything protruding from the surface, which might interfere with me actuating the switch. Then it was on to more stripping and soldering. Here you can see me soldering the positive leads to the back of the switch. I made sure to put some heat shrink tubing on this wire so that I could cover the exposed leads. I'm going to pull this forward as I pop the switch into place. Boom. We got a switch. I briefly mentioned tinning earlier, but it's essentially adding solder to the stranded wires so that it doesn't fray when you go to put it in something like a control box. Finally the moment I've been waiting for, connecting the control box and testing it all out. I just had to make sure that I connected the wires to the terminals properly so that the cool and warm lights would work properly. I ended up hitting a snag here, quite literally, because I couldn't get the control box to slide down this tube. So I had to take the light switch panel off to get access to the wiring and kind of pull it back as I was pushing the control box in. I was finally able to get it positioned inside the tube with a little bit of push and pull. Ta-ta-ta! Time to plug it in. I just had a 24-volt power unit that plugged into the wall and had a barrel connector on the end. This smoothly plugged into the female barrel plug that I installed earlier on the paint rack. The last thing to do is to dim the lights in preparation for testing it out. I think we're ready. The Lord cameth, and he said on the first day, "Let there be light." Here's some beauty shots of the paint rack outside in the complete darkness. It was time to start designing the end caps in Fusion, so I came into my studio and sat down at my desk. This is a desk that I built in the last video I published, so if you'd like to know how to make a really cheap, solid wood top adjustable height desk, go check that out. At 7 feet wide and 2 feet deep, this desk is a beast. It has enough room for my 3 monitors and plenty of activities. Designing these end caps in Fusion was pretty easy. I just had to draw 3 rectangles, extrude a couple of them, create some radiuses, and then chamfer the outside edge and the inside lip. With that done, all I had to do was send the files to my printer and print out 4 of them. Check out these bad boys. I printed the end caps out of TPU filament, which is a flexible filament, making these soft. Also, because they're flexible and they're tight fitting, a friction fit is all I'll need. The only thing to really take note of inserting these end caps is going to be the control box in here and the power input at the back. When you 3D print something, there's generally a seam where each layer starts and stops. So I'm going to make sure that seam is on the bottom of these end caps when I position them so that you can't really see it. Last one. Here's the paint stand with the empty inserts in it. The bottom 3 shelves contain inserts that I found on printables. They each hold 54 paints, and each lower shelf has 2 of them. You can also add 6 paints between them. I couldn't find any solutions for the top shelf online, so I ended up custom designing and printing the top inserts for Pro Acryl paints. Now you get to watch me put all of the paints into the shelf. This 26-minute process has been crammed down to 1 minute. The bottom shelf contains my contrast colors and my express colors, plus a wide variety of different paint lines that I was testing out, such as Army Painter Fanatics, Atom from Ammo, and Scale 75. The second shelf up from the bottom contains the new Vallejo Game Color paint line, plus my metallics. The third shelf holds my AK Interactive 3rd Gen, as well as the old Vallejo model color. As mentioned previously, the top shelf holds all of my Pro Acryl paints. I have every single paint that Pro Acryl has released so far, and there's room for 8 more if they release any more expansions. Alright. It is finally done, folks. This was a really great project because it incorporated a lot of the crafts and things that I enjoy. It had me fabricating and welding the frame, wiring the electronics to get the lights going, designing and 3D printing the inserts and end caps, and of course providing me a way to store my mini paints, which is one of my favorite hobbies. The only thing left to do is to move it back into the studio and hopefully not move it again anytime soon. In my studio, it sits next to the airbrush booth, so I have quick access to it. This is also right behind my desk in the studio, so in order to snag some paints, all I have to do is turn around in my chair and scoot over a couple feet. Having it next to the air booth also worked out because it allowed me to position a light to shine down on the top shelf. Well, thanks for joining me on this build. Whether you know me as Inslow Greymane, the Wily Wizard, or Night Owl Forge, you can always count on me to create something unique and a bit magical. Until next time, keep painting, keep building, and stay inspired.